It's fascinating how much power dynamics really affect our lives,
Yeah.
whether it's at work or in our communities or even just understanding like big news stories. It all comes down to power in some way.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
The sometime hidden but always present world of power and politics in organizations.
Right. And, you are amazing listeners. You sent us some really, really thought-provoking material on this.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, a lot. And our goal today, is to make sense of it all, distill it down to what really matters without, overloading anyone.
Yeah, we want to make it click without making your head spin.
Exactly, because we've all been there. We've all felt that sort of push and pull of power,
Right.
whether we realize it or not. And just getting a clearer picture of what's actually going on can be so powerful in itself. Just having that awareness.
It's like seeing the Matrix. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Exactly.
And it changes how you navigate everything.
So to really hammer home why this matters, we should probably look at that Purdue Pharma and Sackler family story that was in the material.
Yeah, it's a classic example, unfortunately.
Okay. I mean, they built a, multi-billion-dollar empire
Oh, yeah?
by essentially, you know, shaping how doctors viewed and prescribed OxyContin.
Right. It's all about influence, isn't it?
Yeah, and they really went all in. They built these coalitions with physicians. They funded research, but research that, kind of conveniently downplayed the risks of the drug.
Right. Shaping the narrative, you could say.
Totally. And
Yeah.
they even incentivized doctors to prescribe, more and more of it.
Of course.
And in the end, well, they faced major legal consequences.
Right. The chickens came home to roost.
They did, yeah. It really shows just how much impact influence tactics can have
Oh, for sure.
in the real world,
Yeah.
sometimes with, pretty devastating consequences.
It really highlights the importance of understanding, first of all, what those tactics are, but also recognizing how they're being used, whether for good or for bad.
Absolutely, and that's like the heart of what we're doing today. So the mission for this whole deep dive is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a solid understanding of what power is, how it works in organizations, both officially, on paper, and then unofficially behind the scenes, and then all those tactics that people use. How things can go wrong when power is misused, and, of course, the inevitable role of, good old office politics.
This stuff no one tells you about in the employee handbook.
Right. We're basically giving you the inside scoop.
Yeah.
So you can walk away feeling more informed, more aware, and honestly just better equipped to deal with all this stuff. So let's start at the very beginning. What is power?
It's funny. The definition in the material is pretty straightforward, but then when you start thinking about it, it gets, well, complicated.
Okay, lay it on us. What's the textbook definition?
So it says power is, and I'm quoting here, the capacity, discretion, and means to enforce one's will over others.
Okay, so not just being able to make someone do something, but also having the choice of when and how to do it.
Exactly. It's about having the potential to influence, not necessarily always using it. But the material really emphasizes one key thing. Power comes from dependence.
Dependence, that's a word we hear a lot. But in this context, what does it really mean?
So basically, the more person B relies on person A, the more power person A has over person B. It's like a kind of fundamental rule of human interaction, really.
So think about it. Who controls the resources you absolutely need?
Mm-hmm.
Who has the information you're desperate for?
Right.
Who do you have to go through to get things done? That's where the power lies.
And that's where understanding power dynamics becomes so valuable because it's not always obvious.
Okay, so we've got power, but then we also have leadership, which is, often talked about in the same breath.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not exactly the same thing, are they?
No, there's definitely overlap, but they are distinct concepts.
So what's the key difference, according to what we're looking at?
So leadership, the material says, kind of assumes that the leader and the people they're leading share some common goals.
Okay.
Power doesn't need that. Power can be about getting someone to do something whether they agree with it or not.
Right, so a leader might inspire you to work toward something you both believe in. Someone with power might just force your hand.
Yeah, exactly. And there's also a difference in the direction of influence.
Meaning?
Well, leadership tends to be about influencing people below you, your team, your subordinates.
Yeah.
But power can flow in any direction. You can have power over your boss, your peers, anyone really.
That's interesting. So it's not just about hierarchy.
No, not at all. And finally, when we study leadership, we often focus on the leader's style. Are they charismatic? Are they more collaborative? But with power, the focus is more on the specific tactics used to get people to comply.
Okay, so let's talk about those tactics. But first, we have to understand where power comes from. What are the different sources, the bases of power?
So the material neatly breaks these down into two main categories. Formal power, which comes from your position within the organization,
Okay.
and personal power, which comes from your own characteristics. It's who you are, not what your title is.
Okay, I like this.
Yeah.
So formal power first.
Sure. So within formal power, you have three main sources: coercive power, reward power, and legitimate power.
Okay, coercive power. That sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah, it's the do this or else type of power. It's based on the fear of punishment.
Okay, so like a boss who threatens to fire people if they don't meet their targets?
Exactly. Or even just a manager who gives bad performance reviews to people who don't follow their instructions to the letter.
Got it. So what about reward power? Is that just the opposite? The carrot instead of the stick?
Pretty much. It's the ability to give people things they value. Promotions, raises, bonuses, better assignments, that kind of thing.
So if you're the one who decides who gets those rewards, you've got power.
Exactly. And then there's legitimate power. This one's more about authority.
Okay, explain.
It's the power that comes from your official position in the organization. You have the right to make certain decisions and expect people to follow them.
So if you're the CEO, you have legitimate power to set the company's strategy.
Right. Or a manager can assign tasks to their team because that's part of their role.
That makes sense. So those are the formal power bases. What about personal power? That sounds a little more, I don't know, subtle.
It can be. So with personal power, the two main sources are expert power and referent power.
All right, expert power. I feel like I can guess this one. It's about, like, being the best at something.
You got it. Expert power comes from having specialized knowledge or skills that other people need.
So, like the engineer who can fix any technical problem, or the marketing guru who knows exactly how to reach the target audience.
Exactly. They have power because people rely on their expertise.
And referent power.
Mhm.
That's a little more elusive, isn't it?
It is, but it can be incredibly strong. Referent power is about being admired, respected, even liked. People want to be associated with you.
So it's about charisma, personality, maybe even a bit of fame.
All of that. Think of leaders who inspire a lot of loyalty or celebrities who endorse products. That's referent power at work.
Okay, so we've got all these different sources of power, but which ones actually work best? I mean, are some more effective than others?
Well, it's not always a simple answer, and it really depends on the situation and the people involved. But some interesting research shows that dependents, the people being influenced, tend to view leaders who show anger as having higher formal power. And sometimes that can lead to them being seen as more effective, which is a bit counterintuitive.
Really? I would think people would resent a boss who's always yelling.
You'd think so, but apparently the perception of power can be pretty powerful itself. However, the material also points out that if you rely too much on coercive power, the do this or else kind, or if you have very low referent power, people just don't like you, you're likely to see negative outcomes. Decreased loyalty, more people quitting, maybe even sabotage, or people just not putting in their best effort.
Okay, so using fear might work in the short term, but it's not a sustainable strategy.
Not really, no.
Now, we've talked a lot about dependence. Let's dig into that a little more. Why is dependence so central to power?
It boils down to a simple idea called the general dependency postulate.
Okay, that sounds very official. What does it say?
Basically, it says that the more dependent someone is on you, the more power you have over them. It's about controlling resources that other people need.
Okay, so if I have something you really, really want and you can't get it anywhere else, I have power over you.
Exactly. And the material breaks down what makes something truly valuable in that way.
What are those factors?
There are three: importance, scarcity, and non-substitutability.
Okay, importance. That one seems pretty obvious. I mean, if nobody cares about what you have, doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you control it, right?
Right, it has to be something that people actually value, but then it also has to be scarce. If it's plentiful, everyone can get it, and you lose your leverage.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So like diamonds are valuable because they're rare.
Exactly. And the material even talks about how certain jobs are powerful because there aren't enough qualified people to fill them. Like, think about specialized tech roles.
Right, the demand is high, the supply is low. They can pretty much name their price. Okay, so we have importance and scarcity. What was the last one?
Non-substitutability. That means there's no good alternative. If people can easily find something else that works just as well, then your control over the original resource doesn't give you that much power.
So if you're the only one who knows how to fix a critical piece of machinery, you have a lot of power. But if someone figures out a workaround or a different way to do it, your power diminishes.
Exactly. It's all about those unique, hard-to-replace resources.
Now, the material also talks about how these dependencies play out within the structure of organizations. Something about formal small group networks.
Right, so these are basically different ways that communication flows within a group, and they can affect how power is distributed.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are some examples of these networks?
So you have the chain, where communication follows a strict hierarchy. Like, think of a traditional military structure where information flows up and down the chain of command.
Okay, very top down. What else?
Then there's the wheel, where one person is at the center and controls most of the communication, like a manager who gives instructions to their team, but the team members don't really talk to each other directly.
Okay, so the manager is like the hub.
Exactly. And then there's the all-channel network, where everyone can communicate freely with everyone else.
More like a web or a mesh network, right?
Right. Now, interestingly, the material says that the all-channel network tends to lead to the highest satisfaction among members.
That makes sense. Everyone feels more involved.
Right. But the chain can be more efficient for simple tasks because there's less back and forth.
Okay, but real organizations aren't always so neat and tidy, are they?
No, and that's where informal networks come in, the so-called grapevine.
Right, where the real power dynamics play out.
Exactly. It's all about those relationships and connections that aren't on the official org chart.
So how do you even start to understand those informal networks?
Well, there's a tool called social network analysis. It's basically a way to map out how people communicate and who influences who within an organization.
So you can see who the real movers and shakers are.
Exactly. And the material even says that certain personality traits can help people gain power within these networks.
Like what?
Well, some research suggests that people who are less sensitive to social rewards, people who aren't necessarily seeking approval all the time, they actually end up in more central positions in these networks.
Interesting. So maybe it's about being comfortable with a little bit of, I don't know, detachment?
Maybe. And then also extroversion, of course, helps. People who are outgoing and make connections easily, they tend to be more influential.
That's not surprising. But it also mentions some, let's say, less desirable traits.
Right. This so-called dark triad traits. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
Okay, those are some pretty heavy-duty personality types. What do they have to do with power?
Well, individuals with these traits can be very good at manipulating others, building alliances based on, mutual need and maybe even a bit of fear. And that can get them ahead, even if it's not always ethical.
So it's not all sunshine and roses in the world of power dynamics.
No, definitely not.
Okay, so we have a better grasp of what power is and where it comes from, but how do people actually use it? Let's talk about influence tactics.
All right, so this is where the rubber meets the road. The material lays out 9 distinct influence tactics, which are basically the specific ways that people try to sway others.
All right, give me the rundown.
So first, you have legitimacy. This is about using your authority or company rules to back up your request.
So like saying, this is how we do things here, or it's company policy.
Exactly. Then there's rational persuasion, which is about using logic and evidence to make your case.
So presenting facts, figures, data, that sort of thing.
Yep, showing why your idea makes sense. Then you have inspirational appeals. This is about tapping into people's values and emotions.
Appealing to their heartstrings, so to speak.
Right, getting them excited about a vision or a goal. Then there's consultation, which is about involving the other person in the decision-making process.
Making them feel like they have a say.
Exactly. So you're not just telling them what to do, you're asking for their input. And then we have exchange. This is straightforward. You offer something in return for compliance.
A classic quid pro quo.
Yep. And then there are personal appeals, where you rely on friendship or loyalty.
Okay, more about the relationship.
Exactly. Then we have ingratiation. This is about being extra nice or flattering someone before making your request.
Okay, buttering them up a bit.
You could say that. And then there's pressure, which is about using threats or persistent reminders to get your way.
More forceful approach.
Right. And finally, there's coalitions. This is about getting other people to support your request, so there's more pressure on the person you're trying to influence.
Strengths in numbers.
Exactly. Now, not all of these tactics are created equal, of course. Some are more effective than others, and it depends a lot on the situation and the people involved.
So what are some of the most effective tactics?
Well, rational persuasion, inspirational appeals, and consultation tend to work pretty well, especially when the audience is already engaged and interested.
Makes sense. If they're already leaning in your direction, it's easier to persuade them.
Right. But the material also points out that the direction of influence matters.
Meaning,
Well, if you're trying to influence someone above you, your boss, for example, rational persuasion is generally a good bet.
so go in with a well-prepared argument, facts and figures to back it up.
Exactly. But that same approach might not work so well when you're trying to motivate your team.
So with your team, you might use more inspirational appeals, get them fired up about a shared goal.
Right. And when you're dealing with peers, colleagues at the same level, ingratiation can be surprisingly effective.
So building relationships, being likable, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And the general advice is to start with softer tactics like personal appeals, inspirational appeals, rational persuasion, consultation, before resorting to the harder tactics like pressure or coalitions.
So don't go in guns blazing unless you absolutely have to.
Exactly. Now, another thing the material mentions is that people process influence attempts in different ways. Some of it's automatic and some of it's more controlled.
Okay, explain that to me.
So automatic processing is when you kind of react on autopilot, based on gut feelings or quick judgments.
We all do that sometimes.
We do, and that can make us susceptible to certain influence tactics. But then there's controlled processing, where you actually stop and think, analyze the situation, weigh the evidence.
So if you're trying to influence someone who's a deep thinker, you better have a really strong logical argument.
Right, you can't just rely on emotional appeals or gimmicks.
Got it. Now, the material also emphasizes the importance of political skill. What exactly is that, and how does it tie into all of this?
Political skill is kind of like social intelligence applied to the workplace. It's about being able to read people, understand their motivations, and use that knowledge to influence them.
So it's not just about being charming, it's about being strategic.
Exactly. Politically skilled people know how to navigate the unwritten rules of the organization. They know who to talk to, how to frame their arguments, and they can get things done without making enemies.
That sounds like a very valuable skill to have.
Oh, absolutely. And the material even mentions that people who are good at small talk, casual, friendly conversation, they actually tend to be more influential.
Really? So it's not just about being a smooth talker, it's about building genuine connections.
Right. Now, all of this talk about power and influence, it brings up a pretty big question. Does power corrupt?
Yeah, that's the age-old debate, isn't it?
It is, and the material actually presents some evidence that yes, power can have a corrupting influence. Well, for one thing, it can make people more likely to prioritize their own interests over the interests of others. It can also make them more defensive and less open to feedback.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're used to getting your way all the time, you might not be as receptive to criticism.
Right, and power can also lead to overconfidence, which can lead to bad decisions.
So it's like the higher you climb, the further you get from reality.
It can be, yeah. But the material also says that some people are more vulnerable to these negative effects of power than others.
Like who?
Well, people who have a very strong need for power and people who have certain personality traits, like those dark triad traits we talked about earlier, they might be more likely to abuse their power.
So maybe it's not power itself that corrupts, but how certain people handle it.
That's a good way to put it. And the material emphasizes the importance of accountability.
Right, checks and balances, making sure that people in power are answerable for their actions.
Exactly. Now, power isn't a static thing either. People can gain power and lose power. What are some of the dynamics there?
Okay, well, what keeps someone in power?
Well, obviously, consistently using effective influence tactics is important, but it's also about, reinforcing the existing system, making sure things run smoothly, and taking credit for successes while downplaying any challenges or failures.
Okay, so controlling the narrative.
In a way, yes, and power can be lost for a lot of reasons.
Like what?
Well, increased competition, for one. If someone else comes along who's more skilled or has more resources, you might lose your edge.
Right, makes sense.
What else? Ethical lapses, for sure. If you do something unethical and it becomes public, that can really damage your reputation and your power.
And what about just not keeping up with the times?
That's another one, yeah. Failing to adapt to change, clinging to old ways of doing things when the world is moving on, that can definitely lead to a loss of power.
So you have to be adaptable, strategic, and, I guess, ethical.
It's a tall order, but yeah, that's what it takes to maintain power in the long run.
Now, the material also brings up a really important and unfortunately very relevant issue. Sexual harassment in the workplace. How does power play into that?
Well, sadly, sexual harassment is often about the abuse of power. It's more likely to happen when there's a big power imbalance between two people.
So like a boss harassing a subordinate.
Exactly. Someone who has control over the other person's job, their promotions, their opportunities, they can use that power to coerce or pressure someone into unwanted sexual behavior.
That's a terrible abuse of power. The material talks about ways to prevent this, right?
Yes. It emphasizes that organizations need to have clear policies against sexual harassment.
Okay, so a zero tolerance policy, clearly communicated to everyone.
Right. And they also need to have a confidential way for people to report harassment.
So people feel safe coming forward.
Exactly. And then when there is a complaint, it needs to be investigated thoroughly and fairly.
And if someone is found guilty?
Then there need to be appropriate consequences. Disciplinary action, even termination in some cases.
So it's about creating a culture where harassment is not tolerated and victims are supported.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's the responsibility of managers and leaders to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about organizational politics. It's a topic that a lot of people have, strong feelings about.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a minefield.
So what exactly are we talking about when we say political behavior in organizations?
The material defines it as any activity that's not part of your official job description, but is aimed at influencing who gets what within the organization.
So it's about like the informal power struggles,
Mhm.
the behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
Exactly. It can be things like withholding information, spreading rumors, forming alliances, or even just lobbying for resources.
Okay, so it can be subtle or it can be more overt.
Right. And the material points out that people have very different views on organizational politics.
Meaning?
Well, some people see it as inherently negative, like it's always manipulative and dishonest.
Right, like it's all about backstabbing and getting ahead at any cost.
Exactly. But other people see it as a necessary evil, just a part of how organizations really work.
So you have to play the game to get things done.
That's how some people see it, yeah. And then others view it more strategically, like it's a tool you can use to achieve your goals.
So it's about being savvy and understanding the power dynamics.
Right. And the material also points out that sometimes political behavior can actually be positive.
Really? How so?
Well, if it's used to advocate for something that's good for the organization or to challenge unfair practices, then it can actually be a force for good.
Okay, so it's not always a bad thing. But why is politics so pervasive in organizations? Why is it so common?
Well, the material suggests it's mainly because resources are limited, and decisions about who gets what are often made in a very ambiguous environment.
So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of room for interpretation.
Exactly. So people naturally use whatever influence they have to try to sway things in their favor.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about navigating that uncertainty to get what you need.
Right. And the material also talks about the role of gossip, the informal communication network, in all of this.
Grapevine.
Yes, exactly. And while gossip often gets a bad rap, it can actually be a valuable source of information for managers.
Really? How so?
Well, by paying attention to what people are saying, you can get a sense of what's really going on in the organization, who the key players are, what the underlying power dynamics are.
So it's like a form of intelligence gathering.
You could say that, yeah. And the material points out that the people who are most influential in these informal networks are often those who are good at small talk, building relationships, connecting with people.
That makes sense. If people trust you and like you, they're more likely to share information with you.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about the causes and consequences of political behavior. What makes some individuals and some organizations more prone to it?
Well, on the individual level, certain personality traits can make people more likely to engage in political behavior.
Like what?
Well, people who are high self-monitors, people who are very good at reading social cues and adapting their behavior, they tend to be more politically savvy.
Okay, so they're good at playing the game. What else?
People who have an internal locus of control, meaning they believe they have control over their own destiny, they also tend to be more politically active.
Because they believe they can make a difference.
Exactly. And then, of course, people who have a high need for power, they're naturally drawn to political maneuvering.
Okay, so those are the individual factors. What about organizational factors?
Well, the material says that organizations where resources are declining, that tends to breed more political behavior.
Because people are fighting over a smaller pie.
Right. And if there are limited opportunities for promotion, that can also create a more cutthroat environment.
Okay, so it's about competition scarcity. What else?
Lack of trust. If people don't trust each other or the leadership, they're more likely to resort to political tactics.
Makes sense. What about the performance evaluation process?
Yeah, if the way people are evaluated is unclear or subjective, that can create a lot of room for politicking.
Because people will try to influence how they're perceived.
Exactly. And then if the reward system is a zero-sum game, where one person's gain is another person's loss, that also fosters competition and political behavior.
Okay, so a culture of collaboration and shared success might be less political.
Possibly, yes. And finally, high pressure to perform, especially when combined with those other factors, can really ramp up the political maneuvering.
Because people will do whatever it takes to survive.
Right.
The material also briefly mentions the principles of persuasion, which I imagine are pretty relevant to all.
Oh, absolutely. Those are like the building blocks of influence.
Okay, refresh my memory. What are they?
So you have reciprocity, the idea that if you do something for someone, they're more likely to do something for you. Consistency, the tendency to want to be consistent with our past actions and commitments. Social proof, the idea that we look to others to decide what's right or acceptable. Liking, the simple fact that we're more likely to be persuaded by people we like. Authority, the tendency to defer to experts or people in positions of power. Scarcity, the idea that things are more desirable when they're rare or in limited supply. And finally, unity, the idea that we're more likely to be persuaded by people we feel connected to.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. So how do people generally react to all this organizational politics? It can't be good for morale, can it?
Well, for a lot of people, it's not, especially for people who aren't very politically skilled or who are uncomfortable with all the maneuvering.
Yeah, it can feel very stressful and draining.
Exactly. And studies show that high levels of perceived organizational politics are linked to decreased job satisfaction, increased anxiety, and a higher turnover rate. People just get fed up and leave.
Okay, but the material mentions an interesting twist to this, doesn't it?
Yes, it points out that when people both understand the political dynamics and feel like they can play the game, their performance can actually increase.
Really? I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but it might be because when you understand the rules of the game, you feel more in control, you see opportunities to advance your goals. It's not just random chaos anymore.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not necessarily politics itself that's the problem, but how we perceive it and how well we can navigate it.
Exactly. And the material also talks about some common ways that people react to perceived political threats.
Like what?
Well, one common reaction is defensive behavior. This is about trying to avoid action, avoid blame, avoid change. It's a way of protecting yourself.
Okay, so kind of like playing it safe, not rocking the boat.
Exactly. And then the material also talks about voice and silence as responses to organizational dynamics.
Okay, what are those?
Voice is about speaking up, sharing your ideas and concerns. And silence is, well, the opposite. It's about keeping your thoughts to yourself.
So which one is better?
Well, generally speaking, voice is more positive. When people feel comfortable speaking up, it helps the organization to identify problems, come up with solutions, and innovate. Silence, on the other hand, can allow problems to fester and create a culture of fear.
Right. If nobody feels safe speaking their mind, things can go downhill pretty quickly.
Exactly. Now, another important concept is impression management. This is about consciously trying to control how other people perceive you.